Started to the news, and I do apologize for that, but definitely we're going to see what's happening in the world and all along those lines. But first, since it's a late start, we're going to get to our guest, but we will get to news items as well. But first, I'm going to bring on Dr. Chris Wally and all in that space, because I do know that Dr. Chris is definitely an amazing individual, as both a wrestler, that's right, known as the Saint, the Masked Saint, and all along those lines, and has also been involved in the world of religion. So definitely an amazing individual. Glad that Dr. Chris was able to come on, and glad to have this conversation with the Masked Saint. And once again, my apologies, and we will get to some news items, including what's happening in Ukraine and a number of other things in the world as well. So I'm going to bring on Dr. Chris first, and all in that space. How are you doing, the Masked Saint? Glad to have you on, and I do apologize for running late and all in that space. It was a very busy day on yesterday at the Cultural Arts Center that I work at, and a number of other things. So I do apologize for the lateness and all in that kind of way. But I know that you got an amazing life story, because I was reading up on some of that yesterday, being both a professional wrestler and having written that book and all in that space. And I even saw that you had the pleasure of working with Diane Carroll, and of course even having that movie that was produced, I think, by one of those major wrestlers and all in that space. So that was definitely amazing, and to hear your life story and to know that you are founders of a number of churches in that space. So definitely glad to hear your story and to hear what you've been doing, because some people will be going and wondering about how you go from being a wrestler to being a pastor, and some of that aspect of your life story. So once again, my apologies, but do want to hear some of your life story and what that's all about.
Hey, thank you, Mark. It's good to be with you, and it is quite a journey I've had over the last 35, 40 years. From going in 1978, I got into professional wrestling. I was trained by the great Malenko. He was one of the big villains of that day, and I had the opportunity to wrestle and wrestle 4 world heavyweight champions. I wrestled The Undertaker, wrestled the Ultimate Warrior, and it was just, one of those things that you dream about as a kid. But it was kind of unusual that I could do that, because I was that sickly kid. I was in and out of the hospital while I was growing up. Had polio when I was in the 4th grade. I was in the hospital for like 3 months. Had to learn to walk all over again. Just skin and bones. And I had this wonderful doctor that refused to allow me to give up. And he was the one that found out what was wrong with me, why my immune system wasn't working. And he got me on some great medication that helped me, started putting on weight. And he's the guy that got me going to the gym, which I thoroughly enjoy, still enjoy going to the gym. And my body started changing. And then ultimately, when I was in the best shape of my life, had the opportunity to finally fulfill that dream. When you're a sickly kid and in the hospital, you get your days and nights mixed up. And so late at night, about the only thing on TV in those days was professional wrestling. Mm-hmm. And so I got hooked on it very early, and just loved my time in the squared circle.
Yeah, definitely. And I know that my grandfather was very much into wrestling and all in that space. As a matter of fact, if you tried to touch the TV remote at that time, or not so much the remote, but the TV screen, you might get your hands hit and all in that space because he was very much into that space. And I know that Dad wrote a article that was talking about the fake nature of wrestling and all in that space. But when I watch the wrestlers, even if the sport isn't necessarily the true sport in the professional wrestling sense and everything, there is no doubt that those pratfalls are real and those stunts are real and all in that space. So maybe if you could just talk a little bit about the nature of the sport, because I know a lot of people will say, well, that's not a real sport. But I know when I watch those folks and I see the training that wrestlers have to go through, that is no doubt that there is some real exercise and some real physical exertion in those kind of situations.
Well, I'm very blessed. I have the opportunity to speak quite a bit, and I have book signings and things like that. And very often I'm invited, and they show the movie, and then after the movie, I speak. But I always have, Bubba come up to me after everything's over and look at me and say, that wrestling's all fake, isn't it? And I say, how do you fake a body slam? How do you fake getting hit over the head with a steel chair? How do you fake getting thrown out of a ring to a concrete floor? So you're asking the wrong question. It's not fake. It is prearranged. You know who's going to win. You know who's going to lose. But it's a difficult sport. I call it a sport. I can tell you my injuries. I've had a crushed ankle. I've had 5 knee surgeries, dislocated hips, broke pelvis, broke all my ribs, cracked my sternum, both collarbones. I've had both shoulders surgically repaired 3 times, neck injuries, back injuries, over 100 concussions. I got hit so many times in my left ear. I'm deaf in my left ear. Broke my nose so many times I can't breathe out of it. So if it's all fake, somebody forgot to tell me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that was kind of the argument that I was hearing as well, was that while it might be prearranged, it might be definitely some entertainment going on there. There is no doubt that it is some exertion and some injuries that are taking place as well. How much is that faith journey? Because you're definitely a pastor, also helped you with your wrestling and all in that space. Because I would think that the faith journey when you were having those surgeries would be very much an important part of what was going on as well.
Absolutely, it was. I did not grow up in a Christian home, and I grew up in a very dysfunctional home. My dad, bless his heart, I love him, and he's no longer with us. He had a 3rd grade education. He was a long distance truck driver and a 5th degree redneck. My mom did not have any education at all, so I wasn't brought up in a Christian home. But I met this young lady when I was 16 years old, who eventually became my wife, and she's been my wife for 48 years. And she was a very dedicated Christian. She knew what she wanted to do. She, like me, she grew up in poverty. And she said, I don't want to live in poverty. I want to get an education. I want to be a high school math teacher. And so I followed her down to a Christian school in South Florida. And she took me to church, and I heard this wonderful pastor. First time in my life that I ever sat in church and actually understood what the pastor was saying. I've been to a lot of churches and heard a lot of pastors scream and holler. But this guy was able to explain the gospel. And so I became a Christian my first semester in college. And then shortly after, I felt the call of God on my life to be a pastor. And so when my wife and I graduated together, we were back in Central Florida. I was looking to be a youth minister in a church. And I was reading the paper one day in the Tampa Tribune. I saw this advertisement wanting guys to be professional wrestlers. And I jumped up out of my seat and I took it over to my wife, who was grading papers. And I said, look at this. And she looked at it and kind of rolled her eyes. And I said, I'm going. And I packed a bag and I drove over to Tampa. I walked in and saw, the great Malenko, and he's the one that trained me. But faith, wrestling was my dream, but ministry was my calling. I never lost sight of that. No matter how good things were going in wrestling, I knew that ultimately that's not what I was going to be doing. And I retired from wrestling really at the height of my career. I was 34 years old when I graduated from seminary and went to my first church in Central Florida. So faith was a big part of it. There weren't a lot of Christian wrestlers in my day. I would go to the dressing room and find a corner. After I wrestled, I went home to a wife and two little girls. Most of the guys were going to the strip bars and going out and partying, and I didn't do that. So it was a difficult life to maintain your faith and your values, but thanks to I'm very thankful to God I was able to do that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know before I bring on the other panelists and everything, that one of the things that I had read about you was you talk about within your books and on your webpage about the importance of having that financial connection and that importance of finances in relationships. You also talk about the importance of communications in relationships as well. So I'd love to hear a little bit about more of those thoughts, because I know that that is something that you are passionate about, that can be some of the breaking points within relationships, and you have had a very successful relationship, so it has not been one of those breaking points. But I know that that is something that you have talked about, and I know that Lee Newton Rhodes, one of the people that I'm going to bring on, is always talking about values, and maybe we are seeing an erosion of values during this time in the United States and around the world. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about that, and also about the importance of being able to communicate and having those understanding around finances within the relationships as well.
There are three killers in all relationships.
Right.
Whenever I marry a young couple, I require them to go through premarital counseling, and that's the first thing that I start with are the three main killers in marriage. Communication. That's the number one killer in all marriages. A couple just not communicating. Young couples, you'd be surprised, they have absolutely no plan to deal with their difficulties. What do you do when he gets mad? What do you do when she gets mad? Do you have a plan when you have that turmoil in your relationship? Do you have a plan to work that out? And most couples do not. And so that communication, it breaks down and a little sore begins, and then that sore turns into a cancer and it just kills the marriage. So you've got to have communication in your relationship. The number two killer is finances. The average couple today has like $25,000 debt on credit cards. Credit cards are killing us today because people are living off of them. And I know it's a rough financial time, but that's another thing. Young couples don't have a plan financially when they get into a relationship. My wife and I found something late in life because I was one of those. I was in my early 50s. We had money on credit cards. We had two car payments, had a house payment. And I was in debt up to my eyeballs. They don't pay pastors a lot, And so, but I ran across a guy named Dave Ramsey, and he has a program called Financial Peace. And I make sure every couple that I marry goes through Financial Peace, because the whole premise of that is getting you out of debt. And it is amazing the freedom you have when you are debt free. And so we took that. We did the rice and beans thing and paid off credit cards and paid off our vehicles and ultimately paid off our house. And we don't go into debt on anything anymore because of what I went through with that financial peace. And then the third killer in marriage is intimacy. Men think of intimacy one way, women think of intimacy a completely different way. I often say that men are like women are crock pots, but men are microwaves. So that's the difference in intimacy with men and women. Now, communication is a big part of finances, and it's a big part of intimacy. And so those are the three killers. And it's amazing if you tackle those, how much better your relationship will work.
Definitely great points and everything that you're making, bringing in Lee Newton Rhodes. Like I said, Lee Newton Rhodes on other shows has talked about the ways of values and the importance of values here in the United States and all in that space. So Lee, definitely you're hearing a little bit about the Mass Saint and definitely his pastor work and all in that space. But I was wondering some of your thoughts and if you had any questions for Chris and all in those kind of lines. And I'm going to bring in Jacoby as well.
Good morning, Chris. Nice to finally meet you and see you. Welcome to the podcast. You're a minister and you're meeting these new couples. Is it easier or harder for couples to be successful in a marriage or any relationships when they're faith-based versus not faith-based?
Yeah, sadly, I don't know if you guys can hear that music.
A little bit.
Okay. Sadly, I would tell you, Lee, that the divorce rate inside the church is higher than it is outside the church. And that is traumatic because you would think that it would not be that way. But sadly it is. When my wife and I were first married and we had our first child, the church that we were a part of, a great church, and our pastor used to preach on the family every year. For a month, he would preach on the family. And we were like sponges in those days. There's that music again. But we were like sponges. I mean, we have our Bibles from those days with the notes on it. So whenever I became a pastor, I made sure that I preached on the family every year for a month. And, I pastored 3 churches, and whenever I've had the opportunity to go back, the one thing that I get especially from the couples that are now older, is, hey, I can't thank you enough for those messages on the family, and I can't tell you how much they helped us in the early parts of our marriage.
Thank you.
Interesting. No doubt about that and everything. Jacoby, and that might be his son who's got some of that music in the background and everything along those lines and all in that space. But one of the things I was curious about, and something we brought up in some other shows, is there's been a decline in church membership. It seems like during the pandemic, a lot of people were going to the at-home version of services and all in that space. Now, there have been some revivals and things that have definitely been well attended, but I was just wondering your thoughts as to the decline in church membership. Is that a concern of yours as a pastor? And do you think that that is something that is going to change now that we are getting out of the pandemic? Because I do know a lot of folks were concerned that there weren't enough youth voices in the churches and enough diversity in the churches as well. But I was just wondering about your thoughts about that as a Christian leader.
Is that for Jacoby? Is that for me?
Dr. Chris.
Okay. Yeah, it is so important. Give me those basics again, because I thought you were talking to Jacoby.
No problem. I was just asking you about the decline in church.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think for a lot of people, there was that decline, but for some churches that were very proactive, it became an opportunity to reach people in a different way. For instance, during the shutdown, when we were not allowed to corporately worship, our pastor, our senior pastor, was still preaching on Sunday mornings, but he was doing it on Facebook Live. He was doing it on Zoom. He was doing it on other, other ways of getting the message out. And even our life groups, the small groups, we were doing the small groups on Zoom. And so that now that everything is kicked back up and we're back worshiping and we're, our church is blowing and going, we haven't had that letdown from COVID, but we've also added a tremendous amount of people who are now people who are physically unable to attend church that are watching it on Sunday morning on different platforms. And the life groups, the small groups, whereas people who are not allowed to go to life groups because their physical health wouldn't allow them to do that, now they're a part of it and they're listening to that teaching on Sunday morning. And so, for some people, I think they just need to take advantage of the platforms that are available, and it'll help your church tremendously to reach people that you weren't reaching before.
Hey, Dr. Welly, just out of curiosity, one of the things I was curious about is what are some of the things that you learned from wrestling that you were able to bring into your life, both as a pastor and just into your life in general? Because I'm thinking that in that space, you must have learned some life lessons that you were able to translate into the rest of your life, even your life as a grandfather, because I believe you are a grandfather now as
I
well.
am.
So
I am.
What are some of those life lessons that you were able to get from wrestling, maybe from the gentleman that trained you, or just from being in that space for a number of years?
I had a wonderful mentor when I was growing up. She's actually the star of my book, Miss Edna. She's from my childhood, but in the movie, they brought her up to real time, and she's played by Diane Carroll in the movie. But actually, she was from my childhood, and that was unheard of in the '60s for a Southern white kid to have a black mentor. And I learned so many lessons from her. And matter of fact, each chapter of my book, there's a lesson that I learned from her. And there's all kinds of those, lessons, about one of the things that killing the church today is hypocrisy. People living one way outside the church and living a different way inside the church. That was a lesson that I learned from her. Also, you have people that deal with bullies, and there are even bullies in professional wrestling. Mm-hmm. And if you don't deal with bullies, they will continue to bully you. And so those are just a couple of the life lessons. It's amazing that you brought that up because I'm working on a TED Talk, and the title of it is Life Lessons That I Have Learned from Professional Wrestling. And there are 9 of them. Unfortunately, I don't have them in front of me. I didn't even think about that because I don't have them memorized yet. And if I tried to think of them real hard, I'd probably get a brain freeze and it would be embarrassing, the silence you would hear here. So maybe you have me back another time and I'll tell you there's life lessons that I've learned.
Yeah, please do tell us those life lessons that you learned, and all in that kind of space and all in that kind of way. I know that you're scheduled to be on the online dinner party on tomorrow as well, so maybe we can get some of those explanations as well in that time and all in that kind of way. But along with some other guests that'll be on that show. But definitely, Jacoby, did you have any other questions or thoughts that you had in that space? And just hearing about this fantastic gentleman and what he's been doing both as a pastor and both in his wrestling past, because I know that you are a gamer, so wrestling can be very important in that gaming world. So definitely any questions you've got, Jacoby.
Well, interestingly enough, I have 5 little monkeys jumping on the bed going on in the background, which reminds me of my youth and watching, all the wrestling from. I would love for you to get, what other stories do you have from those wrestling days? Because you said a couple of names that I remembered. There was
Undertaker.
Yes, with all those guys, Undertaker, Paul Bearer, Ultimate Warrior, even Goldberg.
Excuse me. Yeah, one of the funny stories it's actually in the book too. Whenever I wrestled the Undertaker, I was not supposed to wrestle him that night. I wrestled earlier in the card. And it was a Friday night, and I was in seminary. I was working on my Master of Divinity in Fort Worth, Texas. And when I wrestled on Friday night, my wife and my little girls would go with me, and they would sit in the audience. And then after I wrestled, they would meet me at the car, and then we would go out and we would do Friday night fun night. But on this particular night, I wrestled. I went back to the dressing room. I'm taking my boots off, and the promoter came in and said, "Hey, the guy that was supposed to work against Mark Calloway, the Undertaker, is not going to be here, and I need somebody to wrestle twice." And I raised my hand because I knew that this kid was going to be a superstar, and he was. You know, he wrestled 3 decades in the WWE. So I had to get a hold of the referee, and I said, "Hey, listen, you know who my wife is and my girls. Please go out there and tell them not to leave because I'm going to wrestle again. But don't tell them who I'm wrestling." And he said, okay. So he goes out and he finds my wife and my little girls, and he comes back and he said, "I found them. They're going to wait." I said, "You didn't tell them who I'm working against, did you?" He said, No. So anyway, I got my boots laced back up and got warmed up. And so I had to go to the ring first because I was not the star. So I'm in the ring, and I'm looking around. I'm trying to find my wife in the crowd, and I found my wife and my little girls. I wanted to see their expression whenever Mark walked into the building. And so the lights went down and that hideous music came on, and Mark walked into the arena. When he did, I looked, and my wife's eyes got about that big, and my little girls started crying. And anyway, my wife, her eyes were so big, and then all of a sudden she reached down and grabbed her purse and started going wildly through her purse. Well, the match was over. It was a great match. We went about 20 minutes. It was a great match. And afterwards, I went out with my wife and my girls, and we had a good time. And we were driving back to Fort Worth, and I looked in the rearview mirror, and both my little girls were asleep. And I looked over at my wife, and I said, "Hey, right before the match started, I noticed you grabbed your purse and started frantically going through it. What were you doing?" And she thought for a moment, and she said, "Oh, I was looking for the checkbook to make sure that you had paid the insurance." Yeah, that's a lot.
Premium's up to date.
Yeah, it's a lot of confidence in your husband, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, she believed that you were going to be safe.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
No doubt about that. Well, tell folks how you can be reached and all that. I did promise folks, and I do once again apologize for the lateness, but we will get to a couple of news items, including one that I know Lee is probably wanting us to talk about and all along those lines. But if you can tell folks really quickly how you can be reached, and then we'll get to a couple of news items. And I am looking forward to the continuation of the conversation on tomorrow afternoon and all along those lines. But definitely, I think folks have got some insight, but definitely tell folks how you can be reached and about the book and the movie.
Okay. Yeah, you can, I answer every email. If you want to email me, it is the Masked Saint, and that's MASKED, the Masked Saint 59, the number 59 at gmail.com. It may take a couple of weeks, but I will answer you. I guarantee you. But if you want to contact me on Facebook, you just go to Chris Whaley on Facebook. I usually have about 5,000 friends, so sometimes you can friend me and sometimes you can't, because every now and then I say something that ticks somebody off, and so they unfriend me, so that's okay. But anyway, Facebook, you can send me a message on Facebook. I'd love to hear your questions. But my website is themaskedsaint.com, and you can contact me that way too. Like I said, the movie is playing on Amazon Prime. If you have Amazon Prime, you can watch it. If you have Tubi, Tubi, you can watch it. It's on Tubi. If you have PureFlix, which is like the Christian Netflix, PureFlix, it's on PureFlix also. The book, you can get it on Amazon, or if you want an autographed copy of the book, you can get that off of my website. And I love people. I love hearing from people, and so anybody who wants to connect with me, I'd love to do that.
Sounds great. If you want to stick around for the 10 to 15 minutes that we'll have on news items, you are more than welcome to stay in everything. But one of the news items that I heard about, and I know folks will be interested to know about what's going on in the world, but apparently Hunter Biden is going to plead guilty in a deal that likely avoids time behind bars in a tax and gun case. So I know some folks have been paying attention to the Trump indictments, but there's also one now involving Hunter Biden, and apparently there is a deal that has been placed in that space, and the Coast Guard is giving updates on a missing submarine that was exploring the Titanic wreckage. So that Titanic wreckage took place some time back and all along those lines, but there are folks that are definitely looking at that. And speaking of, as I did earlier, Trump, there is a judge that has set a tentative trial date for the Trump documents case. And of course, we do know that Russia continues its attacks on Kiev and other Ukrainian cities in an overnight airstrike. And Anthony Blinken is still going on there with his China trip, and is apparently saying that he is looking at trying to improve some of those relationships as well. So that is some of the things that are going on in the world and all in that kind of way. So that is some of the things that folks may be interested in talking about. There is even a threat of Putin using tactical nuclear weapons. That is what Biden has said, and he said that that threat is very real and that it is definitely a possibility. And as I was talking about, Blinken and Xi over there in China have agreed to stabilize relationships, but the differences remain unsolved. So a lot of people are looking at China as an economic power and trying to figure out what our relationship will be in that area. And Europe is aiming to cut China risks, but not necessarily China ties. So they're looking to ban companies from making sensitive tech in the country of China and all in that space. So that is something that's going on. And for folks that are wondering about things that are dealing with global warming, they are saying that the Himalayan glaciers could lose up to 80% of their ice by 2100 as temperatures continue to rise in that world. And Europe is the fastest warming continent in the world, according to a WMO and Copernicus report. That is one of the warnings that folks are given in that space as well. So that is some of the things that I am seeing in the news, including the UK Parliament Back's report that Boris Johnson had lied over some of the things that were going on during the pandemic in terms of a Partygate that is going on. So just like we had Watergate, apparently there's a Partygate that is going on over there in London, and huge firefights erupt as Israeli forces raid Jenin, and that is something that we're seeing in the news as well, because they left 5 Palestinians dead in that area. And the Finland parliament has backed Petteri Orpo as its prime minister, replacing Sanna Marin. So that is some of the things that I am seeing in the world and in world news and all along those lines. I usually would have got that at the beginning, but definitely the way that things going, we brought it up at the end instead. And polls are open for the primary elections over there in Virginia on Tuesday morning. So definitely there is a race that is going on in that space and all along those lines, because we know that there are races that will be going on for a while in this area and all along those lines. So last but not least, Tropical Storm Brett has expected to become the first hurricane of the season. And I know that I actually got caught in some of the weather that might have been part of that on yesterday and all along those lines. So it is expected to be moving over the Atlantic. It will produce some rains in different provinces of the Dominican Republic. And I think here in North Carolina, we're supposed to have this kind of cloudy, rainy kind of weather for the next several days. And last but not least, Andrew Tate has been charged with rape and human trafficking. And definitely that is something that is going on over there in Romania and all in that space. What was the question you were going to ask and all?
Mark, I have another commitment at 11, so I can't stay on, and I'm sorry, because I'd love to talk with Lee and Jatovi and you, but I do have another commitment. I'm going to have to leave, but I look forward to being with you tomorrow.
That sounds good, and definitely looking forward to that as well. And we're actually going to be having an abbreviated version of the show anyway because of my own lateness and all in that space. But definitely appreciate you being on and appreciate your sharing some of your thoughts and all along those lines. But definitely that was some of the news items. But I'm glad that folks were able to get some of what you were all about as well.
All right. God
bless.
Nice
meeting you, sir.
Bye.
Come back in. God bless.
Yeah. So those were some of the news items that
Yeah, Mark, I just want to add on the missing sub. As far as I know, it's a manned sub, and they only have so much air on there, so it is very serious. Besides the equipment,
Yeah, that would make sense. Yeah, because it is a man sub, I believe you are.
Toby, you're muted.
It's been going for what, more than 24 hours, but it only has 16 hours of airtime. If
I'm not sure how much air they got. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely a serious thing. The scary part is that it disappeared within a few hours after leaving. They lost.
That is weird.
Yeah, they lost connection. It was just a few hours after they left. So I don't know if the sub just hit something and is gone. Just something happened. And I mean, it's a tragic situation because I don't know how anyone is going to be able to survive that. To be honest.
The backup plan. Mark, you mentioned a possible Hunter Biden plea bargain.
Yeah, so
I didn't hear anything about that. Do you know what he's pleading to?
I'd have to look it up and see what he's pleading to, but it looks like he was pleading guilty in some sort of deal. But I can look that up and see what exactly he is pleading to in this particular case and everything.
Because putting Hunter Biden aside, to certain people they plead guilty and there's no jail time. It's just a parking ticket. It's just doing business.
He's pleading guilty to federal tax charges and strikes a deal on a gun charge.
So while there may be no jail time, you're saying there may be possible civil or monetary penalties?
Yeah, I'd have to do some more research on that. But I mean, if you're taking this plea, that doesn't necessarily exercise you away from civil kind of complaints as well. I'm thinking that is saying that you can't serve the criminal aspects and all in that space if that is the deal that they agreed to. But I don't know enough.
I get all that. I just don't see a plea deal, him being guilty, tarnishing his resume.
Right. I don't think it will harm his resume.
In all honesty, this right here, this charge is the firearm purchase. Well, the lien that he had, what was it, 400? Hunter Biden previously told he has paid outstanding tax bills, according to public records, more than $450,000, and state liens in Washington, D.C.
So it might be he has to pay up all those debts.
Yeah. So the gun
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Federal law prohibits firearm purchase by anyone who uses or is addicted to illegal drugs. So that'd be the firearm charge.
Yeah, that would definitely be the firearm charge. And, one of the other things that happened, it was sad. I know we talked about Juneteenth, but there have been incidences around Juneteenth, including one that was canceled because the Juneteenth celebration in Asheville was canceled because of violence that took place. And apparently there was some violence at one that took place in Milwaukee and one in Illinois. So unfortunately, sometimes people will take parties, and I know that that'll probably be the case with 4th of July as an opportunity to, kind of exert whatever their frustrations are and all along those lines. As a matter of fact, one of the Illinois.
Just going to say, Mark, we can't wrap it around parties. That's just a day in a life in America.
Right.
It could be a party. It could be, hey, I'm just upset at the world.
Right.
That's the problem we have. We just had the championship celebration for Denver when they won the NBA championship. There was a mass shooting then.
Yep,
We're having a mass shooting every day.
Yeah.
Can you guys explain to me something? I just don't get this. I understand people, really have their own team that they root for, but who would get into violence over a sports event? I just never understood that. People fighting in the stands. I never.
It's the same with sports. It's the same thing with religion. With the same thing with
politics. No, sports is just a freaking game.
Yeah, but for some, religion is just a book.
I get you.
So if you have that passion over something, and then somebody has a passion else, on the opposite side, then if my team is winning and I talk junk to you, if you take it the wrong way, then you may snap and want to fight. A lot of these instances, you could have two people cheering for the same team. but oh no, you stepped on my shoes and now we're gonna fight, or something is. There's just many things that can set people off, because I mean we don't live in a society where everybody is going to be so perfect towards each other. People can get mad at anything. But,
unfortunately, even a
yeah.
game.
Yeah, they can definitely get mad at anything, including a game, and all along those lines. I mean, definitely we are seeing that going on, and I know we're going to start the Ukrainian show very shortly. I just saw that Dr. Jonathan Lockwood is already ready to go. Still waiting for Ivan, if Ivan is showing up, and Sasha can tell me if he is showing up or not, and all along those lines. But yes,
Ivan is not available today, so we'll do it with Dr. Lockwood.
No problem. So we'll be with Dr. Lockwood, and we'll get ready to start very shortly with that and all along those lines. But, you know, the only other news items I was going to get to really quickly before we start with the Ukrainian show and all along those lines is that there were several people dead after a fire at an e-bike shop in Lower Manhattan. And definitely some people, I'm sure, will be looking at that as a reason to look at some of those equipments, because people will find different ways to use what happens, whether it is a gun incident or a number of other incidents, just to bring in their cause and everything. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things that the Illinois lawmaker said, was that he was questioning the semi-automatic gun ban after the Juneteenth shooting. So I do know that sometimes when these incidents happen, people use that as a fodder for their conversational points and all along those lines. And the only other thing I was getting ready to get to sports, and we never got to this last week, and I've been meaning to tell Kim that I would get to it, but we need to give a shout out, just like we gave a shout out to Denver, to Las Vegas, because last week they did win the Stanley Cup, and we never did mention that. So I did promise Kim that I would get.
They're not coming on the show?
Huh?
They're not going to come on the show? We should get them as a guest.
Yeah, maybe we'll get them as a guest. We can see if we can't get some of the
or a representative.
as representative of the team as a guest. I'll reach out to them, just like I reached out to Chris Whaley and other things, and maybe I'll reach out to some people from the massive Marlin folks that were disqualified from a North Carolina fishing tournament, and apparently that cost their crew $3.5 million. So maybe I'll have them going out on the show as well after a 619-pound blue Marlin was disqualified.
What you may want to do is, talking about sports and people getting upset at sports, you may not only want to do the Vegas talk, have Vegas on to talk about the Stanley Cup, but also get reps from Vegas and reps from Oakland, because right now the Oakland A's are potentially moving to Vegas, and they honestly may move.
Wow. That would be amazing and all along those lines. But like I said,
wouldn't say amazing. Because you got a whole city that's about to lose a team. They are
New York. Jacoby, New York lost the Dodgers, the Brooklyn Dodgers.
New York lost the Dodgers, and let's not forget that what was it, Baltimore, that had that midnight run when a certain team left and everything, and they literally left in the middle of the night.
Yeah. And that was in Atlanta when the Braves moved to Atlanta back in the 60s.
Hey, don't miss out. Don't forget about the Browns going to Baltimore, because that also happened. And then the Browns went to, they did go to Baltimore. And then the Browns came back. Then you got the Texans. That was Tennessee. Tennessee moved to Texas. And then Tennessee came back. So, we'll see what happens with Oakland. That's a big one.
Yeah, that's a very big one and everything. Well, I do appreciate folks holding it down. And like I said, I do apologize, but I think we got to some of the news items. I'm sure other people will be willing to talk about them on the other side and all along those lines. But I'm actually going to start Sasha off as we are going on and getting ready to go off and all along that kind of space. But if there are any things that y'all want to share in the news or things that I've brought up, I'm still trying to figure out, that's a whole lot of money to be losing over a Marlin disqualification. But if there are things that you want to bring up in the news or have any other thoughts, go for it. And all that. But definitely thanks to Toby for reaching out to me, and definitely we'll keep his TV ship rolling right on.
I'm just wondering if Jacoby's son's going to get a talking part in the show eventually. He's showing up so much. He's a regular.
Well, if he gets going, he will get going. Matter of fact, he starts laughing at Mark because he loves Mark's voice. We'll sit there and laugh at Mark every time he starts going.
Well, I'll see you guys tomorrow. Take care. God bless.
Appreciate you. Definitely, we're going to get on out of here. We'll have more conversation tomorrow. I can't remember if we've got a guest or not, but we're going to get on out of here. And y'all have a great morning. And of course, there'll be other shows going on as well. So we'll catch you later on and definitely have some more interesting conversations on the World Edition.
Great guest today, Mark. Thank you.